shadowed Earth. In a future where technological marvels have transformed life on Earth, humanity reached a breakthrough that once seemed like an impossible dream: the ability to control the sun. It was called the solar grid, an advanced network of satellites designed to regulate and distribute sunlight, offering a solution to humanity's most pressing challenges: energy shortages, food crises, and climate change. Initially, the solar grid was hailed as the greatest humanitarian achievement of the century. No longer would people suffer from droughts or the ravages of global warming. Deserts could bloom with life, crops could grow in regions once too harsh to sustain them, and clean, abundant solar energy could be distributed globally. It was an answer to the inequality between nations, offering a future where everyone had access to the same life-giving sunlight, regardless of geography or circumstance. The vision was beautiful: a world united under the shared brilliance of the sun, where technology served the greater good of all humankind. Scientists, politicians, and leaders celebrated the promise of an abundant future, and the technology behind the solar grid became the pride of the international community. But as with all human innovations that begin with noble intentions, the solar grid soon became something far darker. When the solar grid was first launched, it operated as a global public good, managed by an international coalition. However, as its immense potential for control became clear, the richest and most powerful nations began to view it not as a tool for the betterment of humanity, but as a commodity. Slowly but surely, they privatized it, selling ownership of the solar grid to corporate interests who recognized that whoever controlled the sunlight controlled the world. Governments and corporations realized they could profit by regulating access to sunlight. In the wealthiest nations, the sun shone as brightly as ever. People could pay for extra hours of daylight, perfect weather patterns, and tailored climates for their industries and cities. Massive solar farms in these regions generated immense profits as they sold sunlight both as energy and as an essential resource. But for poorer countries, the cost of sunlight became an impossible burden. Crops began to fail in developing regions, where governments couldn't afford the astronomical fees for adequate sunlight. Farming communities, once reliant on the regular patterns of nature, now found themselves at the mercy of powerful corporations that owned the sun. Without sunlight, there was no food. Without food, there was famine. And so, the once bright future became a nightmare for the poorest of the world. They had to beg for sunlight. And when their pleas fell on deaf ears, entire countries descended into chaos. The governments of wealthier nations, content with their unending daylight and blooming economies, turned a blind eye to the suffering. Their focus remained on profit and growth, unconcerned with the consequences their control over the sun had unleashed. In regions without access to enough sunlight, life began to collapse. Starvation swept across continents. Food riots and water shortages became the new norm. Cities in the global south were plunged into darkness as the solar grid selectively shut off their access to sunlight. People tried to farm using artificial lights, but it was too little, too late. The sun, once a universal provider, had now become a symbol of privilege, hoarded by the rich and powerful. In an ironic twist, the very technology designed to bring equality to the world now enforced a new kind of tyranny, where nations no longer competed for oil, water, or land, but for sunlight itself. The world's elite justified the shift in moral terms. Lobbyists and media painted the privatization of the sun as a necessary evil, arguing that the solar grid required vast resources to maintain and that someone had to pay for it. Those who could not afford the sun, they said, needed to adapt, innovate, and find other ways to sustain themselves. As with so many other breakthroughs in history, pharmaceuticals, nuclear energy, and the internet, what began as a gift to humanity was corrupted by those seeking profit. The comparison to drugs was apt. Just as life-saving medications had once been priced out of reach for the poorest, so too had sunlight, the most essential resource of all, been turned into a commodity. Not everyone was willing to accept this new order. A group of disillusioned scientists, some of the very architects of the solar grid, saw the horror their creation had become. They had once believed in the transformative power of the solar grid to lift humanity into a new golden age. But now, they realized they had built a weapon, one that could be used to control life itself. Operating from the shadows, these scientists and activists formed the Solar Rebellion, an underground movement dedicated to freeing the sun from corporate control. They worked to hack the solar grid, fighting against the monopolies that had turned sunlight into a luxury. Their mission was dangerous, but the stakes were too high to ignore. The rebellion spread quickly. Across the globe, people rallied to their cause, demanding that sunlight be returned to the people. Protests erupted in cities where the sun still shone brightly, with demonstrators calling for an end to the privatization of natural resources. In the poorer regions, where darkness had already settled in, uprisings and revolutions began. The solar grid's controllers, now fearing the loss of their power, struck back. They unleashed drones and security forces to crush the rebels, and disinformation campaigns painted the Solar Rebellion as anarchists threatening global stability. The powerful elite were determined to hold on to their control of the sun at any cost. As the rebellion worked tirelessly to reclaim the solar grid, the world teetered on the edge of collapse. Protests broke out in cities around the world, with people demanding access to sunlight. The wealthy nations that controlled the grid were besieged by global outrage, but they refused to relinquish their hold on the most valuable resource of all. And so, humanity stood at a crossroads. Would the sun remain in the hands of the few, or would it be returned to the many? The answer, like so many before, would depend on whether people could learn from their past mistakes, or if they were doomed to repeat them. In the end, the tragedy of the solar grid was not just the greed of those in power, but the fact that it had once been a force for good. Just like medicine, energy, and information, the light of the sun had been twisted into a commodity. And as with every great advancement before it, the technology that was meant to save the world had instead become its downfall. The sun, once a symbol of life and hope, had become the most expensive thing on Earth. In the end, the greatest evil wasn't the technology itself. It was humanity's willingness to sacrifice everything, even its own soul, for profit.